welcome. My name is Arnold Canvas. I'm from Suffolk University, which is in Boston. And welcome to Healthcare Mini-Track and IT Adoption, Diffusion, and Evaluation. Quite a mouthful. So it's adoption for short. Session 3. Glad you could join us today. And I don't want to take any of the author's time, so let me just say, please indicate your name and email on this sign-in sheet so we know who's here and interested, and so we can be in touch. Please pass that around if you haven't filled it out already. And I think we're all loaded up and ready to go. So first paper.
Thank you. So hello, I'd like to welcome everyone, and I'm glad that you came in. My name is Bahae Samhan. I'm from Washington State University. I'm a third year graduate student. I'm doing my PhD at MIS. I'm here with my amazing advisor, Dr. Joshi, and thankfully she's here with us in the audience. My paper is Resistance in Healthcare Information Technology, Literature Review, Analysis, and Gaps. So this goes as the first essay of my dissertation, where it could serve as an introductory to my empirical work that we're planning on having in essay 2 and 3. It's basically a literature review, and we're investigating the research gaps in this area. So first I'm going to start with the phenomena. The report from the Convent of Health Investments shows that $1.7 billion being spent in the U.S. on HIT, on these technologies. Most of them in facilitating projects or medical information clinical technologies. However, the United States falls behind in HIT adoption. So despite that much money being spent in the sector, this report goes back a little bit in 2006, but this is still applicable even in 2014. I don't know about the numbers yet. I didn't find the report that is most recent. But you'll find that the US, it's like 28% in 2006 and was 17% in 2001 compared to Netherlands, New Zealand, UK, Australia, Germany, and Canada. And interestingly, even Canada is in the line as well. So it's like the US continent more than the US country. And those technologies being invested and created are supposed to be used by practitioners and patients. However, those are the people that, for reasons that we're going to be investigating again, are the most resisting it. So an example comes from the CSMC in Los Angeles, and this is a hospital that had 870 beds, and they deployed a system on 2/3 of the beds, and then they had to shut down that project just because physicians or doctors didn't want to work with it. So they had to shut it down, and it was a complete failure for them. So technology resistance is the main reason of system failures, just like the example that I just provided. And the main problem is that these systems are mostly very useful, and the ease of use is not an issue when you're dealing with these systems because doctors are used to use those systems. So ease of use is not a problem for them. Usefulness is something given, yet it is being resistant. So Baraji and Hickman argues that it cannot be simply defined as the opposite of usage. So not only because it's useful and easy to use, or it's not easy to use and not useful, then it's going to be rejected. It can't be explained that way, and we need to have a separate definition for resistance. Having said that, very limited work has been done in IS for resistance. So LaPonte and Rivard in 2005 did done a review for the past 20 years on IS and IT journals, and they found only 43 articles that had looked into resistance, and only 9 of which had defined or conceptualized resistance. And even those definitions and concepts, they were different. They weren't like unified. So they still did not agree on one conceptualization of resistance. So as Hertz et al. Said, there is a critical gap between the IT providers and the IT users. So it's just like people are developing these systems, they're spending a lot of money per year investing in those systems, and then they're going to waste. No one is using them. It's just me. Again, this is a little bit like 10 years ago. I'm not so sure how accurate it is 10 years later, but despite the efficiency of these, I think only 10 to 15% of the hospitals are using them. That was like 10 years ago. However, I got this report from the CDC.gov, and it shows that almost more than half, it's 52% of the physicians are not willing to use EMRs, electronic medical records. So 32 has no intent to purchase an EMR, and 20% are undecided yet. And this goes to 2011, so a few years ago, and we have more than 52% of the hospitals or doctors are not willing to use it. So my research objective is to conduct an extensive review of the literature, and then to uncover the current status of the literature and find the research gaps. My research question obviously was, what are the research gaps in the current literature that needs to be addressed in the HIT resistance? So how I went about it, first, I searched the IS literature, the medical literature. I divided, I'm going to show you a graph, the relevant and irrelevant papers. So I selected the most relevant papers. I synthesized my findings, and then I reported the gaps. The keywords I was using were health, IT, IS. I tried my best to find anything to do with resistance. So resistance, rejection, adoption barriers. So it has so many naming in the literature. So in the coding process, I started to create article summaries. So I started to summarize my articles. So based on where was the study published, how was the resistance defined or characterized, what was the theory behind it, at what stage did the resistance occur? Was it at the implementation, was it post-implementation, or was it even before that? They didn't even want to do anything with the system. What is the research design? So what is the sample? And how did the data be collected? And what unit of analysis? Also, I looked into the word process study. We're going to be talking about this in a minute. And this is basically the technology being studied to perform this certain task. And interestingly, you find very minimum task being studied. It was basically CPOEs and EMRs in most of the papers. So there are so many other technologies in the healthcare that are still understudied. And the type of technology that we use. So my findings, or I synthesized the findings before getting into the gaps. So I tried to explain how each article is similar or different in terms of the phenomenon, the research question, the method, what did they find, and how was resistance measured and explained. My 3 areas of research were healthcare, IT, and resistance. Now, I had defined 4 areas in this research. The first area is healthcare and IT, but it has no resistance in it. The second is healthcare resistance, but there's no IT. And this is an interesting area where people are resisting the healthcare itself regardless of the technology. So I read a few articles in that, some of them go back to religious causes. So one of them is a famous Brazilian soccer player. His name is something Kaka, I forgot his first name. And he refused to get physician therapy on his knee, and he ended his career because of that. It's just because his religion or his, I don't know what he believes in, but it just refuses him to go to doctors. So the third is IT, IS, and resistance. And this basically says that it's IT resistance regardless, it's out of healthcare. And that's a relevant area. So I consider resistance to IT in general is relevant. And then the most general area is HIT resistance, which combines my healthcare, my IT, and resistance. Okay. So I looked into 3 and 4. I consider 1, 2 as relevant. Okay. Any questions before I go into research gaps? Okay, so my findings came into 7 research gaps. The first one is that the resistant construct is multifaceted. And basically what that means is that all the studies have in common that they define and conceptualize it differently. As I said at the beginning, there was no one common definition of resistance. There was no one common conceptualization of it. So for example, Keene in 1981 defined it as a social inertia. So it was going from a social versus psychological point of view. Where Zeltman and Duncan in 1977 used the concept of resistance to change from a managerial point of view, or a management point of view. Marcus in 1983 used the power game. So you either gain or lose power, and based on that you would decide whether to use or to resist your. It was actually changed, so it was not technology. So, but whether you're going to use or not use chain. The second emerging gap was the absence of a unified theory. So here, as I said, we didn't find one unified theory. Just like in adoption, I would say that TAM or TAM2, UTA2, UT, you can say those are unified theories that are helping in adoption. Whereas in resistance, we don't have something similar. We just have a number of abstract constructs that are used to predict resistance, such as perceived threat, net gain, power loss, but those are abstract, and these remain unclear and needs further exploration. So for example, Sinfitel in 2004, he assumed that inhibitors are a reason to resistance. Baharachi and Hickman in 2007 used the famous perceived threat, and it seems like everyone afterwards have been using this as the main antecedent to resistance. Icard et al. In 2009 found social impact. So found social impact as a previous antecedent to resistance. My third research gap, and this is very important, it's patient related, and I could not find, neither me or other reviews have been done before, any paper that discusses patients' point of view. All the studies were conducted at hospitals, to doctors, physicians, clinicians, managerial workers, but none of them were on patients. Why do patients might resist technology? So that's something interesting, and we might need to look into it. Even though we have medical mobile apps now that are reachable to patients, they can monitor their sense. The keynote speaker have talked about this, about the sensors that now people could use to evaluate themselves. Yet none of these studies were evaluating patients, and I believe that he touched base on that. He said that we're having less research on patient side. So most of HIT studies have focused only on the practitioner, physician, nurses, managerial, but not patients. My fourth one is related to the amount of work being done in a healthcare setting. As I said, I had two areas of research. The third sector was the IT, and the fourth one was HIT, resistance. So most of the papers were in IT resistance, and there are not a lot either, but still was focused into IT, and very few were in HIT. So out of this 20 years research that LaFontaine Rivard done, they found only 43 articles, and only less than 20% were in HIT. So if you do the math, that's less than 10. So almost 5. Now, the nature of the technology and support system, and this gap goes and relates itself to the actual technology being studied in those very few papers. Basically, they focus on CPOEs and EMRs, electronic medical records. There are plenty more than those technologies in the healthcare, very advanced technologies. There are so many areas of research into those technologies, such as there was a case in Canada with a handheld ultrasound, and it was also a case of failure. But we're lacking those research into those types of technologies. Basically, it's CPOE or EMR, and I would say 90% of the papers. And the other 10%, I would say they're only clinical or managerial work costs. So the main focus was HER or CPOEs. So we were lacking like diagnostic systems, caregiving technologies, monitoring systems. We didn't see a lot of research in that area. Also, we noticed, or I found in the research gaps, that the role of beliefs needs greater theorization. We don't know a lot about beliefs, other than considering perceived threat as a belief. Maybe we're missing a lot. So an example would be the effect of social beliefs. And Icard and Lumar in their book in 2012, they mentioned that we're missing a lot on social influence as far as resistance. Also, the social influence ties to the patient-centric thing. So if you want to do social influence, they're doing it on doctors, they're not doing it on patients. Maybe some of them are resisting the technology based on family, friends, or maybe even resisting the healthcare itself based on a belief in a religion or friends. So there's a lot of social influence coming in. Also, beliefs of patients towards receiving healthcare itself. So maybe the patients are resisting healthcare rather than resisting the technology, and eventually they would resist the technology itself. So if you don't want to get the care, you will not get the app for that care, right? Also, we noticed that there is limited attention given to individual differences. There was only one paper in 2010 done by Close, and this finding actually was from Lumar 2011, and I kept looking for it. In 2014, it still holds that only one paper talked about individual differences in HIV resistance. And it was not a healthcare, so it was social difference in an IT. So in conclusion, the contribution of my work was to uncover the potential research streams of work on which future research can be developed. So basically, I'm finding the research gaps. In future work, we're trying to provide a research agenda for the HIV resistance, and this is something I'm willing to work on, and it's part of my dissertation, so we're going to move forward with this. A better understanding of user resistance obviously may help to get better systems that are functional. And also this ties to the designers of the systems, whereas they would know that why, if we know why our physicians or patients refusing to use these or resisting these technologies, maybe we'll try to do some changes in the design and building it. And of course, if we knew that and we provided better systems that are going to be adoptable, then we're going to have more system success rather than system failure. Okay. So that's it for me. If you have any questions.
Okay. Plenty of time for discussion, questions. Please.
Sure.
So, can you go back to the slide where you showed how you define resistance? What the terms were that you used?
Right. Yeah. You mean the keywords?
Because there was somebody, I don't remember who it was, and it might have been about 10 years ago. Somebody wrote a paper where he said, let's not use the term resistance.
Right.
And so I wonder, so you've got resistance, yeah. So some people are using non-use.
Or non-adoption.
Or non-adoption,
Right.
Yeah. So adoption would show up with, if on the keyword for adoption, non-adoption would still show up.
We'll still show, and I've done adoption barriers because I noticed that most of them do that.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that
non-use
when I put use or non-use, you get so many papers. It's like I would say for us, it was like 300 plus papers just use. So I had to even look into that and find the ones that talked about non-use. So.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Because what I was wondering was the more recent papers might have shifted to that broader terminology.
And actually, that's something that we pinpointed, that there is no one broad terminology. Even that, they didn't agree on it. So we don't have one term like technology acceptance model. We don't have like resistance or technology resistance model. So yeah, but I tried my best to look into all of the keywords that are possible to find. And after finding these papers, I've done some where I go back to the references and find any paper related to resistance and get those and start doing that. So it's a long process of finding it. And this is a very recent, so that was up to 2014. So.
Oh, okay. So you weren't restricting yourself just to the keyword search.
No. I've been expanding.
It might be useful to do the non-use and go back to what you were then. You look at the abstract, but maybe more to see if there's another terminology. I'll be interested in, I don't want to ask the question to the questioner, but why not use the resistance? It is different.
Oh, I think the argument against using the term resistance is that it implies a motivation on the part of the user. And so there is research that says that there's a whole range of reasons why people might not use technology at a moment in time. There's also an interesting stream of research on people who might be characterized as initial adopters, but then choose not to use the technology at certain times versus other times. And so that's the argument for the broader terminology, because it doesn't, the word resistance implies a judgment of what the user is doing before you examine what the user is doing.
And the reason I like the word is because you may be using it, but still resisting, because it's mandatory. And you might have unintended sabotage or other type of behaviors that can be captured in resistance. Although they're adopters, they're using it, they have no choice.
We were had a session yesterday, and there was a physician who was talking about that. He said that they're using the EMRs, but he doesn't like it. He doesn't want to use it. He's wasting a lot of time from his point of view. He said instead of spending time next to the bed or seeing 4 patients, now I'm doing 5 reports. So that's how they're doing it. So he would rather have someone to do the data entry for him on the system while he does what he does best, which is giving care.
Right. To follow up on that, the resistance or indifference or adoption, whatever it is going to vary a lot based on who the user is or the type of user.
Right.
So physician, nurse practitioner, administrator, case manager, patient, they're going to have wildly different motivations and attitudes towards adopting or resisting the IT. So if you make an interesting complex of anding and oring, so non-use and nurse is going to really cut down your answer set, right? Non-use and physician is going to cut down your answer set. So I would play with different Boolean combinations.
Thank you. That's very good. Yes, Dr.
Okay, the keywords obviously make a lot of sense, but I was also wondering about the research method, because if you're trying to identify gaps, then qualitative, interpretive, critical approaches, that might be where the gap is. Okay, and if only a few studies show up, but because the method is different, you're going to see things that won't be seen in all the other studies. So in addition to the keywords, I know the more things you add, the more things you find. Okay, but not necessarily in terms of only looking for keywords. You can also search for words in the abstract. Okay, I mean I do that now. I don't like keywords because when I'm an author and they ask me for keywords, I just make up things. Because I just don't care. The night before, I just make up some keywords.
Right.
So, also searching through abstracts, but not only substantive things such as health IT resistance, but also the method.
Right.
And also with respect to looking at gaps, because that's the title, you want analysis and gaps in the literature. I would think that different countries have different healthcare and different so-called resistance phenomena. They might not call it resistance. So being able to target journals, say in the Nordic countries, might tell us something different. Targeting journals from Canada, for example, would tell us something different. So, but those wouldn't necessarily come up in just keywords, but they might come up in the abstract.
Yeah. What?
Yeah, or full text, but that would make it even more unmanageable in terms of the things.
So these keywords I use in abstract and full text, but I haven't looked into the whole method things, or as Professor Ronald said, maybe doing a Boolean thing like nurses and one of these. But I have looked into abstracts and the whole text using these keywords.
Yes, I think the terminology, they use these words to search the title, abstract, and the keyword option.
Other questions? Yes, we have one.
Thank you for an interesting presentation.
Thank you.
In terms of gaps, I was just wondering what are your next 1 or 2 main priority research questions, or what's next in terms of what are you targeting?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. So personally, on my dissertation, my next step would be to compare models and come up with differences in that. But if I want to advance on this paper, I would take it more to patient-centric, because that is where I feel that it's the most valuable thing, and everybody is trying to target it, and yet it's missing. It's really missing into this area. There are no patient studies. All of the studies were done on practitioners. So.
And I think one other thing, and it's very difficult to do, but if you look at healthcare, workflow and work processes are very important to them. But as I asked researcher, maybe because it's easier to get access to certain types of technology, it may not be easier to see other types of technology and get access to it. But what we saw that the doctors may not resist to everything. It may be depending on the electronic health record may be boring and manually entering everything and taking away the time that they can spend with the patient. May be true for that type of class of technology. But what if it helps? What about diagnostics? It is helping them. advances that have software capacity, maybe they would resist to that. So we need to nuance that a lot more. And HIT is not monolithic. I think somebody is interested in definitely use nuance the technology. And then the material, the properties are different.
Maybe it's also a part in my work with a hospital in Germany. I discovered that the people are willing to use new technologies, they are willing to change, but unfortunately they have long-term contracts with system distributors that are not willing to change. Maybe that's also a research gap to find some new contract models in order to use flexible technology or to change really fast if there's a new technology.
But I wish this was a problem here in the U.S. We don't contract yet. I wish. Germany is one of the best in adoption. So in the U.S. we lag behind way back in time. So yeah, I wish that the problem is that they're contracted with one technology and they don't want to change to the other. It's rather they don't want to use it.
All right.
I think one back here.
Just a quick comment. As far as the, I wrote a paper that just talked about this subject, and it didn't get accepted in HICSS, and it was about what, no offense.
No, it should be a good thing.
I mean,
right?
we need more time, I think, to get it together, but what we looked at was, how do physicians, use EMRs, and how how is resistance, looking at knowledge change? You know, that construct about how physicians, want to change but really don't want to change. So defining the resistance that they were faced with was the hardest part of it, and I'm sure you're facing that if you're looking at the literature. And one of the things that most of the physicians said, it was a structured interview with short questions. And one of the things that they said was, I want to do it, but I don't want to do it because it doesn't meet my needs. And just like somebody else said, I want to provide, my job is to provide patient care, not to sit and type. And I can't type fast, and I'm not this, and it doesn't work with dictation. I'm used to dictation. So you might want to consider not only looking at one group of users like physicians or nurses or therapists who also use that, but also look at the age ranges, because the knowledge base that say, for example, the physician would have, if he is newly coming out of school, and this is what some of our study looked at, if he comes out of school, he's more likely to be able to pick it up, and it's part of what his training has been versus the older physician who now is starting from ground zero and going, okay, they want me to change yet again for another new system. Oh my God, this is weird. And also there's that philosophy in the back of your head is, it's the flavor of the month. This hospital that I'm working at, they're going to change and they're going to give me a new system in 2 weeks. Why do I want to learn it? So there's those kind of issues I'd like to just add to your thoughts.
And I noticed that there is a trend now in universities where they're trying to combine health colleges and IT colleges to find something common where they produce or they graduate doctors who are familiar with these types of technologies, so they don't face that tough resistance.
They're doing it a lot in, like University of Maine has it with their health.
Western Michigan was one. I had a conference there and they had that. So that's interesting.
Thank you.
Well, we could go on and on and on. So thank you for all the nuances being added to the conversation and things, new words to consider as you go forward. So thank you very much. Thank you. So without further delay, let's move to paper 2.